Finally, on this Martin Luther King Day, a look at a movement the civil rights era sparked. Dark Days, Bright Nights, From Black Power to Barack Obama is the new book by Peniel Joseph, professor of history at Tufts University and a NewsHour regular. I spoke with him earlier in the historic U Street corridor of Washington, D.C., at the African American Civil War Museum. Peniel Joseph, welcome back to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Let's begin with the phrase Black Power. When did it first gain currency, and who was it who was using it?
Well, it's a phrase coming out of the 1960s and really coming out of the civil rights era. Stokely Carmichael was a civil rights activist who first used the term in Greenwood, Mississippi on June 16, 1966. And for Carmichael, he really was referring to political self-determination. He felt that black people needed political, social, economic self-determination if they were going to really exercise their democratic rights in the country.
But didn't that phrase also carry a kind of electric charge that it elicited a reaction not only from black people, but from white Americans as well?
Absolutely. As soon as Carmichael says it, it becomes a racial controversy. It becomes a national controversy. It's going to be perceived as fomenting violence, as anti-white, as really the opposite of civil rights and Dr. King's dream of a beloved community.
I know how people heard it, but what did Stokely Carmichael mean when he used the phrase Black Power?
Well, Carmichael was really one of the few civil rights activists who becomes a Black Power militant. So Carmichael had been a grassroots organizer in Mississippi and Alabama, and for him, Black Power meant actually exercising the voting rights and exercising the citizenship rights that he had struggled to organize along with many other civil rights activists during the first half of the 1960s. So it meant black elected officials, it meant black political leaders, but it also meant community control of schools. It meant a different definition of black identity. Before this period, African Americans were really called Negroes or referred to as people of color. It's after the Black Power period that they're referred to as black or Afro-American, and by the 1980s, African American.
The book reminds us of parts of this story that we sometimes forget because the history of this era gets smoothed over. Weren't there many strands of opinion about how to proceed, what the best approach was, what the tactics were to achieve black liberation?
Absolutely. When we think about our civil rights history and the history of the 1960s and 70s, in a way we flatten that story to a story about Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, the Voting Rights Act, and the I Have a Dream speech. People like Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael added their voices to that period of time, and they were really voices of trying to transform American democracy, but in militant and at times combative ways.
So how do you take us as a narrator from the foment of the 60s to the election of Barack Obama?
Well, when we think about Obama, Obama is very, very important. He's usually connected to the civil rights movement. And Obama himself talked about the Joshua generation and said that his generation was the generation after the Moses generation, which was the King generation. One of the things I argue is that when we look at Barack Obama, he grew up politically, at least, in Chicago, and that's Harold Washington's city. And Harold Washington was the first black mayor of Chicago elected in 1983. So against the conservative backdrop of Ronald Reagan's America in the 1980s, there are really rays of light in Harold Washington's Chicago, which inspires Jesse Jackson to run for president in 1984 and 88. So Chicago and Jesse Jackson really impact the country's evolution from Black Power to Barack Obama. The Jackson campaigns are very interesting because it's those campaigns that change the Democratic Party's primary rules to proportional representation from a winner-take-all system. Without the Jackson campaigns, Hillary Clinton would have been the Democratic Party's nominee in 2008.
The Chicago that schools Barack Obama in politics is not only Harold Washington's Chicago, it's also Jesse Jackson's Chicago, it's Louis Farrakhan's Chicago, the Johnson family of Ebony and Jet magazine. Aren't a lot of different ways of being black in America proposed during this era? Absolutely.
Another person in Chicago that is Reverend Jeremiah Wright. And Barack Obama is in his Trinity United Church for 20 years. And I think that's a very interesting example of Johnson's Chicago, Louis Farrakhan's Chicago, Jeremiah Wright's Chicago. Obama takes all that in. He doesn't embrace all aspects of it, but he takes it all in and becomes more rooted in African American culture than at any other time in his life. So by the time we see him on stage as a candidate in 2008, even his very deliverance of speeches at black churches, the way in which he walks. Sometimes people in the African American community will say that Obama walks with a swagger. All that is from Chicago and his time in Chicago. And really what's interesting is that it's the Black Power movement's self-determination to get black faces in higher places that really leads Obama to even try to run for president. Because remember, Obama initially is not embraced by the civil rights generation. People like John Lewis, Vernon Jordan, Andy Young. These are all people who were part of that civil rights movement but didn't think the country was prepared to elect an African American president. So in a way, when we think about Black Power and Barack Obama, Obama really reflects a kind of moderate and pragmatic strain of that movement.
You cover this in the book, but isn't there sort of a central argument that goes all the way back to the 19th century, whether you're talking about Booker T. Washington or W.E.B. Du Bois or Marcus Garvey or Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, whether black Americans ask for their freedom or whether they seize it and make it theirs? And where does Barack Obama fit in that age-old debate?
I think he has one foot in both camps, which is what makes him so interesting and so unique. Because on one level, his whole rhetorical embrace of democracy during the campaign, it's firmly rooted in this notion of acceptance and waiting and patience. But on another level, being a junior senator from Illinois and saying you're going to throw your hat in the ring and aggressively pursue the presidency is rooted in that other, really much more ambitious self-determination camp to try and just really take the American dream and claim it and own it and utilize the power of the highest office in the land to try to transform American democracy.
Professor Joseph, good to see you.
Thank you for having me.